Dr. McKee.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mason, and everybody. And while I'm bringing up my screen here, there we go. Let's click on that so I can see myself. Okay, and if the Julia who signed on here is who I think it is, hi Julia. She's been to Taung with me. So, but Taung is quite a big story in many ways in paleoanthropology. And most scholars think that the story begins with Raymond Dart. And indeed it does to a certain extent, in that he was a professor and dean at the University of the Witwatersrand Medical School in Johannesburg. And he was an anatomist. But the story doesn't really start with Raymond Dart. It starts with this young lady right here to his left. That's a young lady who is a student named Josephine Salmons. And she had some connections, and she brought to Raymond Dart, oops, go back here, there we go, a fossilized extinct baboon. And Dart asked where that was from, and she told him it was from Taung, and Raymond Dart took some interest in this. He had never really had much of an interest in fossils before that, but he took an interest in it and asked that any more fossils from Taung be sent to him. And so this is Taung, South Africa, as it looks today, well, at least 20 years ago, how it looked. And Taung is on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. There we go. Here's Johannesburg up here, and this is where Taung is. Quite literally at the margin of the Kalahari Desert is, this is the edge of it right here in this picture behind me. So it's a fairly remote place. And back in 1924, it was a lime quarry. South Africa needed limestone for processing gold, which had been discovered in Johannesburg. And they don't use that process anymore, but back then limestone was used, and there was plenty of it at Taung. They also needed limestone for agriculture and construction and what else. So the limestone business was quite huge. And they were blasting away with dynamite in the limestone at Taung. And every now and then they'd hit a pocket of red sandstone. And that red sandstone represented the ancient infill of ancient caves that had formed in the limestone. And they filled up with all sorts of interesting things. So Dart asked that fossils be sent to him. And a geologist named Robert Young went down to Taung, and he sent Dart some fossils. The quarry workers, including the manager, had all sorts of fossils they were using as paperweights on their desk and whatnot. And so Robert Young picked all those up and put them in a box, sent them on a train to Johannesburg. And Raymond Dart opened up that box. And the first thing he pulled out happened to be this. Got it here for scale. May look like a rock to you, but Dart, being an anatomist, he was also an expert on the brain. And he immediately recognized this as what we call, is what we call an endocast. I guess I don't have that on there. What happened is, many years ago, probably about 2.6 million years ago, a skull fell into a cave, filled up with the red sands of the Kalahari. And then when the quarriers were working away, they blasted out this rock, which was the inside of the skull, and the brain shapes the inside of the skull. So Dart could see the gyri and sulci of the brain. He could see this artery here, which is the middle meningeal artery that supplies the coverings of the brain. And so he thought this was very interesting. But it didn't look like the baboon fossils that Josephine Salmons had brought him. So he started looking at it more carefully, and he noticed one thing, and that is that the foramen magnum. Now, foramen magnum is the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord meets the brain. He noticed that that was fairly far forward. So there's a position of the foramen magnum, but in quadrupeds and chimpanzees and gorillas and whatnot, the foramen magnum is back here. So he immediately thought, this is a different kind of creature. It's not a baboon. Brain's larger than that of a baboon. The foramen magnum is in a different place, moved forward. And so he reached into the box and he saw a rock that looked like this. And he noticed that that rock perfectly fit the endocast. So he started chipping away. And in a legendary 40 days, 40 nights, that's actually true, he revealed this face. So once again, here we have child from Taung, or the juvenile. We know it's a juvenile because these are the deciduous teeth, the baby teeth. And this is the first permanent molar. The first permanent molar is just coming into occlusion, which means, it's coming into abutting the other molar. It's not quite there yet. You can see there's a gap there. That's the first permanent molar coming in. Now, in a human, the first permanent molar comes in at about age 6. But we were able to determine that this individual, which doesn't look like a human child, probably was about 4, maybe 5 years old when it died and got deposited in a cave at Taung. Well, that was perfect for Dart because Charles Darwin had a prescient insight. He wrote in 1871, when he finally got into human evolution, in each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region. It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. So this was a Darwinian hypothesis that we evolved in Africa. Well, I had the occasion to meet Raymond Dart himself at his apartment with his wife, Marjorie, on the occasion of his 94th birthday. And it was quite a grand affair to be able to meet him and talk to him. But even at 94, he was still quite feisty. He had quite a history of being feisty, but even at 94, he was still feisty. And he said to me, "Darwin predicted that man evolved in Africa, and I proved it." So he didn't really prove it, but he gave the first good evidence of it. But not everybody accepted that idea. When he published it as Australopithecus africanus, Austral means southern, Pithecus means ape. So it's a southern ape of Africa. But when he published it in 1925, not everybody accepted that it was a human ancestor. They thought, well, Australopithecus is a good name because it's a southern ape. It's not a hominin ancestor. So we were just talking about fossils going to other places. Well, Raymond Dart took the Taung fossil to London to try to convince the European scholars that this was indeed a human ancestor. And they still were not quite receptive to it, even though he was there in person. So he left quite dejected, took a ship back to South Africa. His first wife, Dora Dart, stayed behind because she was working on a degree. And Dart left the Taung fossil with the famous anatomist Grafton Elliott Smith, so he could study it more and finally get convinced of the hominin status of this fossil, hominin being a member of our human lineage. So he left, but one of the great stories was that Grafton Elliott Smith studied it for a while, still wasn't convinced, but he gave it to Dora Dart to transfer back to South Africa on her trip home. But she went to her room by a taxi and was getting ready for bed and realized that she didn't have the Taung fossil with her, that she had left it in the taxi cab. So this little guy was taking a trip all around London for the night until she called the police and the police tracked it down and whatnot. She got it back. But she then was able to take it back to South Africa. But I did note that Dora Dart was his first wife, and I think it pretty much has to do with this cab incident. Okay, so why was Taung rejected? By the way, I can't see all of that. Can you see the whole screen? Okay, just my screen. Okay, so why was Taung rejected? Well, one was a matter of geography. No one expected that humans originated in Africa. In England, the European scholars there thought, oh, it certainly was Europe and certainly was England because we have this fossil from Piltdown. Piltdown ended up being a fraud, by the way. But fossils were coming out from Asia, and because of what Linnaeus had written about our relationship to the orangutan, people thought Asia was the origin, certainly not Africa, and certainly not, and here I'm quoting Raymond Dart, the asshole of Africa. So that was an impediment, but they had forgotten what Darwin had said. Darwin had hypothesized that we originated in Africa because of our relationship to the chimps and the gorillas. So they had forgotten Darwin's insight. But that was one impediment. The other reason for the rejection was because Taung Child was a juvenile. And although they respected Raymond Dart as an anatomist, they thought, no, he's just confusing this juvenile for a hominin. Well, back then it would have been hominid, but that's another story. Because it does look somewhat like a chimp. So here's a drawing I did for my textbook of the Taung Child compared to a juvenile chimpanzee of the same age. Now, you can see that they have some similarities, but they're quite different in many ways as well. But back then, they didn't have, huge samples. They didn't have juvenile chimpanzees to compare to their dental age and whatnot. So they thought, well, it's just an ape. Also, the idea that bipedality came first. Bipedality is walking on two legs. Dart deduced that this thing was upright and bipedal. They thought, because of this forgery at Piltdown, that the brain was the first thing to evolve. And that with a large brain, ancestors were able to stand up and walk around in a civilized manner. Certainly, bipedality, walking on two legs, did not come first. But they had forgotten Lamarck's insight. Remember Lamarck? Lamarck is the much maligned scientist who came up with an idea of transformism, which was a pre-Darwinian idea about evolution. It's just that he got the mechanism wrong. But in 1800, or at least the early 1800s, Lamarck predicted that bipedality, walking on two legs, was the first step, both literally and figuratively, of human evolution. So they had ignored Darwin, they had ignored Lamarck, but Dart proved it, that this was what had happened. The other problem is the unknown geological age of Taung. Nobody knew how old it was. And estimates ranged from 10,000 years to somewhere around 2 million years old. So no one knew how old it was. That 10,000-year-old figure was used by the European scholars, particularly Sir Arthur Keith, who was associated with Piltdown, to argue against this being an ancestor. But after Dart had published on Taung, there was a series of 5 papers with date estimates ranging from 10,000 years old, which was the first one, to other figures in between. The odd thing is that each of those 5 papers was written by Robert Broom. Robert Broom was a South African physician who dabbled in paleontology. He found a lot of the mammal-like reptiles in the Karoo, and he found some key hominin fossils as well. But he was pretty much just guessing, but it fueled all the speculation about Taung not being able to be an ancestor because of its age. Well, now we have adult Australopithecus africanus fossils, such as this one discovered by Robert Broom. And we have them at various sites in South Africa between 3.4 and 2.5 million years ago. And once we had adults, then gradually the European scientists started accepting the idea of a bipedal, small-brained ancestor. So we have lots of evidence for human evolution. And I just want to put the Taung skull into context here. We start somewhere around 6 million years ago. The genetic data suggests that chimps and humans diverged between 5 and 7 million years ago. And so we have some curious fossils, such as this one from 6 million years ago, well, 6 to 7 million years ago, Sahelanthropus chadensis, which might be a hominin ancestor. It might be a gorilla ancestor, who knows? Later on, then we have Australopithecus afarensis from East Africa. That's Lucy's species. And it was around for 1 million years in East Africa. And it was also an upright, bipedal, walking on 2 legs, small-brained creature. Then we get to South Africa, 2.5 million years ago. Well, actually 3 million years ago, with Australopithecus africanus, slightly larger brain, slightly more modern teeth. Then there's this huge divergence in hominin evolution. Actually, we now know there are many small divergences. There's a huge divergence with Australopithecus robustus and Australopithecus boisei, the robust Australopithecines, evolving along a separate lineage and eventually going extinct. On our lineage, something led to early Homo habilis. They're still small creatures, about 3.5 or 4 feet tall. But their brain was starting to expand and become more complicated. The brain was starting to lateralize. And with we get 2 particular areas of the brain, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, which are associated with language and speech. And at the same time, we start getting stone tools, well, at least around that same time. And so language and tool making seem to go together. Homo habilis and its associates eventually evolved into Homo erectus, first in Africa. And that's when we get to our full body size. And eventually we get more sophisticated stone tools and the controlled use of fire. And we move beyond Africa into Asia and beyond, ultimately. Oops. Following Homo erectus, we have a whole bunch of what I like to call evolutionary experiments. They're known as the archaic Homo sapiens, including the Neanderthals. And so the taxonomy of them is kind of messy, but if we call them archaic Homo sapiens, they are almost us, but not quite us. And so by 100,000 years ago, we get Homo sapiens sapiens, our own species, our own subspecies. And we continue to evolve, but we are at least our own species by then. So where does the Taung Child fit in? It fits in right here with Australopithecus africanus of South Africa. The problem with Raymond Dart is that, he got all the stuff out of a box. He's called the discoverer of the Taung Child. He discovered it in a box. It was sent to him by the geologist Robert Young by train. Dart himself did not go to Taung until 1948, when there was an American expedition there. So not a whole lot was known about Taung. So Raymond Dart's successor was Philip Tobias, who became the doyen of African paleoanthropology. And here he is showing me, yeah, that's me. I have the same tie to prove that that's me. We had very thin ties back in 1986 when this picture was taken. And Philip Tobias showed me the Taung Child and was showing a whole bunch of us who were new to the department, the Taung Child. And here's a side story. I have lots of side stories. But as he was showing us the skull, he wanted to point out some particular features. And so he asked one of the doctors who was there at the table for something to point with, and he gave him a mechanical pencil. And so Tobias, the revered doyen of paleoanthropology, was pointing out things, but he didn't realize the lead was out on the mechanical pencil. And he was drawing all over the original of this precious fossil. We all stood there in horror. Do we stop him? But this is Professor Tobias. I mean, he's godlike, So we were in quite a quandary. Fortunately, pencil marks came off quite easily, but it was quite a memorable moment. Okay, well, Tobias, in his own inimitable way, commanded that I go out and find more fossils of Australopithecus africanus at Taung, go forth and multiply. And so that is what I did. And that ended up being one of the biggest adventures of my life. So off we go to Buxton. Buxton is the village where the Taung fossil site is located. And we went out there. This is our field office. This caravan here. We drove out in what's known as the dynamite truck. And that's because it was designed to carry dynamite. In the old days, paleoanthropologists used dynamite to get fossils out. we didn't use any dynamite, but because we were using the dynamite truck, we had the exhaust in the front so it wouldn't ignite the dynamite in the back. That convenience goes window of the driver of the dynamite truck. But off we went for this adventure. We ended up in Buxton, and off in the distance is the remains of the lime works, where the Taung Child had come from. And as we drove in, this is what the area looked like in terms of how people lived. Because at the time, the Taung site in Buxton was in a homeland called Boputetsuana. It was part of Grand Apartheid, where these homelands were set apart by the nationalist government. And this is how most people lived. It's greener than normal because there had just been a spring rain, but normally it's just dry and dusty and brown. There's nothing there. And when Boputetsuana became a homeland, the limestone quarry pulled out, and all these people were left behind. So they were very happy when I'd come along every year and offer them jobs, offer some of them jobs. But this is what the quarry system left behind. So up here, like this picture behind me, is the literal southeastern margin of the Kalahari Desert. And so they quarried down to a certain level, and then they quarry down to another level, and then they go down to yet another level. But every now and then they'd encounter these sandstone pockets that I talked about. And that did not have economically viable limestone, so they left those behind. And that's great for us because that's where the fossils are. The sandstone is from ancient caves that filled up with the red sands of the Kalahari and bones. So these are the two haystacks in which we were to find our needle. This pinnacle right here is known as the Herdelich Pinnacle. Alois Herdelich, a German-American scientist who founded the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, was the first scientist to visit Taung, and he found some fossil baboons here. But this monument here was placed as an approximation of where the Taung Child had been found. So it is closer to this other pinnacle, which we call the Dark Pinnacle. But that turned out to be too dangerous to work. And so we started working on the face of the Herdelich Pinnacle because we knew that Alois Herdelich had found some baboon fossils there. So me and my students started chipping away at the face of this ancient cave infill. And after about a week, we found a tooth, a tiny little rodent tooth. And I got all excited. My students were like, Dr. McKee, you're crazy. That's just a little rodent tooth. That's nothing exciting at all. But I said, yes, but this means we know we're digging in the right place. We are about to find a lot more fossils, like Alois Herdelich did. And we did. We started finding more fossils. The next year we came back. We got a little bit more sophisticated. We set up a larger grid system, and rather than chipping away at the face, we started drilling down from the top through the roof of the ancient cave down into the deposits with the fossils. And I'm sorry, but I get sentimental whenever I see this drill because I spent a lot of time with this drill. What we do is we drill holes into the rock, break off blocks, and then take them to this mock grid area we then break those rocks down into small as possible rocks, unless we find a fossil in them, in which case we take them to a second mock grid system so we can keep track of where all the fossils come from. So each one of these little piles here has some fossils in it. We found thousands and thousands and thousands of fossils at Taung. Excuse me. Now this red sandstone is something we call breccia. Breccia is an Italian word for broken things, something like that. So here, one of my locally hired workers, Amos Liu, has broken open this rock, and there, if you look carefully, is some blackened bone. And that ended up being the back of a skull of an extinct baboon. But these people I hired at Taung, or from the village of Buxton, had no formal education at all. But within just a couple of days, they were able to learn how to identify fossils from the tiniest rodent tooth to the back of a skull to other things. So they have no formal education, but I'm pretty sure that most of you do. So have a look at this piece of breccia and see what you can see. Well, here's a bit of vertebra in the vertebral column. Here is an oblique section of a long bone, like the bone of the forearm. And then if you look carefully, you can see this circle here. That is an orbit, the left orbit. Here is the maxilla, or the upper jaw. Here's the cheekbone. And so carefully we chip out these fossils, and eventually we can reconstruct them to look something like that. So there's the fossil. You can see it now. Here's what we get. There's the fossil. And so it's a painstaking process to get it out of the rock. You know, this is not like East Africa, where, you know, every year you go back after there's been some erosion and you walk through the desert and you trip over a bone and you pull out your camel hair brush and brush away, and oh, look, it's the Lucy skeleton. Doesn't work in South Africa. We go through solid rock. And so it's a very painstaking process. But as you can imagine, in a village of Buxton with mostly Swana people, also some Zulus and whatnot, I was quite an item. So the village of Buxton was kind of below the fossil site, and every now and then an old man would walk up and say, Mr. Jeff, everybody knew me as Mr. Jeff. Mr. Jeff, how does it come that that bone gets in that rock? Kind of like the ship in a bottle problem. Well, let me talk about that for a minute, about the geology of the Taung area. This is a river, fossil sites just over that hill there. And the area is made up of dolomite. That's the bedrock. Dolomite is this Precambrian rock, limestone, that formed at the sea bottom and eventually got pushed up into the continent. And it's a limestone, so it's porous. And it fills with water and it forms water tables. And then the water tables come out as springs and they feed this river here. But the water has limestone dissolved from the dolomite in it. And then it forms a type of rock called tufa. And here is a tufa cave, like the kind that the Taung Child was being excavated out of. And they're fairly small caves compared to other South African sites, which have these massive dolomitic caves. This is a tufa cave. It's basically 15 meters across and about 10 meters deep. Okay, well, we we work at Taung in the wintertime when it's dry and not so hot. Every now and then I would visit during the summertime. And basically, you get up in the early morning and do some work and sit under a tree the rest of the day until the evening when it was okay to go out and do some more work. While I was sitting under a tree, 3 young boys came rushing up to me, said, Mr. Jeff, look what we've got. And there from a chain, dangling from a chain, was a dead juvenile baboon. Now, they were all excited about this because to them, baboons are vermin. You know, they raid the little crops that they have, and they're just a nuisance. So they set out snares to catch the baboons. I actually, studied the baboon troops at Taung and wrote a couple papers on that as well. But they thought of them as vermin. And so they were very excited that they had snared and killed this juvenile baboon. And so they wanted to give it to Mr. Jeff. And who is Mr. Jeff to say no to such a charming offer? But I thought I can do something useful with this. And so we took it down to that tufa cave, that one right there. We placed it inside there. This is just kind of done for the picture. And did what's known as a taphonomic experiment. Taphonomy, taphos means grave, so taphonomy is the study of the grave. It's the study of what happens to something after it dies. And we thought that we could utilize this as a taphonomic experiment to see what happens to a baboon, like the baboons we were finding at the fossil site, and that Herdelich had found at the fossil site. And there we get a big hodgepodge of fossils. So we put this in there. A month later, still summer, I came back, and this is what was left of that juvenile baboon. Here you can see, here's a humerus, which is bone of the arm. Here is an ulna, this is a bone of the arm, and others scattered about. This is the cranium or the skull, and this is the mandible or the lower jaw. So just within that month I had been gone, the action of the maggots that were eating the flesh of this had removed the skull or the mandible from the rest of the skull. Well, you can imagine that if a leopard or something was bringing in animals like this, that they would accumulate at the sediment. The red sands of the Kalahari would blow in, build up. They'd be solidified by the lime in the water. And that is how that bone gets in that rock. Now, we found lots of fossil baboons, and they are interesting in and of themselves. These are large males of 2 different species of extinct baboon that we were finding at Taung, as compared to a modern day female baboon. And male baboons are larger than females. So one thing we can see is that baboons have gotten larger over time. And we can see that the brains have gotten larger over time. So we have these very squat brains in these extinct species, but a somewhat expanded brain in this female baboon. But when we looked at the long bones that we were finding in the cave of these baboons, they were the same size as a modern day female. So what that means is that over the last 2.5 million years, baboons have not only expanded their brain, but expanded their brain for their body size, which is the same process we went through, is expanding our brain for our body size. So give them another 3 million years and they might be doing Zoom calls on extinct humans or something, who knows? Okay, well, that's all well and good. I love the baboons. But the anthropologist's dream is a beautiful woman in one hand and the fossilized skull of Australopithecus in the other, at least according to Gary Larson. Now, my female graduate students remind me that this is the male anthropologist's dream. But here we have, you see my one arm? I have the beautiful woman, but my other hand is empty. Found all sorts of cool fossil baboons, but no Australopithecus. So I started looking at the site in a different way. We'd been digging up here in the Herdelich Pinnacle. This is the monument, and at the tip of that monument is supposedly where the Taung Child was found by the best historical reconstructions they had at the time. But about that time, a friend of mine, an anthropologist from Italy, brought me this picture that his uncle had taken in 1925. This is Lidio Cipriani, took this picture. And sorry, I think it was 1927, I forget. Anyway, he took this picture of this bit of remnant, and where this man was, Cipriani never published this, but he stated in his notes that where this man was the approximate place where the Taung Child had been found. Well, I immediately recognized this as the Dark Pinnacle. And so I borrowed a ladder from some people in the village, Buxton, and went up to that same spot. There I found some breccia, but nothing really promising. But you got to remember that all this came out with blasted dynamite. Nobody knew where the Taung Child had actually come from. You know, they blasted away. There's this fossil on the ground. It could have come from anywhere. At the time, they saw that red breccia up there and said, oh, okay, well, that must be where it came from. But paleoanthropologists, well, archaeologists and paleontologists in general tend to dig down. So I started thinking about that. And all of this overburden had been brought in for the revealing of this monument to the president of Botswana. But I thought if they can bring all that stuff in, we can take it back out. And so there was road construction going on nearby, and we hired this guy and his bulldozer to come in and bulldoze away all this overburden. And we did that on a Saturday morning. It's probably one of the most fun Saturday mornings I've ever had. Because this isn't the normal way you do paleoanthropology. But we were very careful in how far we let him go down. I asked him to accidentally run into this monument because goodness knows what might be underneath that monument. But he wouldn't do that. So what we did, we bulldozed away all this overburden. And then we started clearing off the quarry floor because remember, the quarry goes down to various levels. And so I thought, well, in the quarry floor, there might be some remains of the Taung deposit. So we started over here and we found a neat cave, but it was not a fossiliferous one. It didn't have fossils in it. We kept on going until we get right to the edge where the quarry goes down to another level. We started finding fossil deposits. And among the things that we found was this yellowish eggshell. There's also a bit of turtle carapace here in this specimen as well. But the quarry workers, when they were quarrying for limestone, talked about finding yellowish eggshells before they found the Taung Child. We thought they were mistaken because in the Herdelich Pinnacle, we had been finding limestone nodules that kind of looked like eggshells. When we found this, we realized, oh, we were talking about yellowish eggshells. Here is one. And there's nothing remarkable about it itself. I mean, we know birds were around back then. It is kind of remarkable that over 2.5 million years ago, some guinea fowl hatched out of this egg, and that eggshell is still there all those millions of years later. But the significance of it was that we knew we were in the right place. Excuse me. Also found baboons, the mandible or lower jaw of another species of extinct baboon, known as Parapepiobrumi, and it is an older type of species. As we went back across the quarry floor, we were going back in time. So we got to an older deposit, as evidenced by this and by the stratigraphy of the site. But alas, after finding these deposits, the Taung Child itself remained an orphan. We didn't find, as Tobias had commanded me, kith nor kin of this lost child. But it was all worth it because we found out more about the context of the fossil itself. And that's something I try to emphasize to my students as we start this semester here, that the context of a fossil is as important as the fossil itself. So we were able to reconstruct the Taung environment on the basis of the animal species that we excavated. And we found that in the past, it had been a savanna grassland. Now, Raymond Dart had proposed the savanna hypothesis of human origins, that the reason we became upright and bipedal was to walk across the savanna grasslands rather than live in the forest. Well, it turns out he was right, but for the wrong reason. He assumed that the Taung region had never changed from what it is today. But actually, just 100,000 years ago, it was a complete swamp. So he was right, but for the wrong reasons. We now know that hominins did not evolve specifically in the savanna, but evolved before that in forested environments. But nevertheless, Taung, being in a savanna environment, while other fossils we have are from forested environments, shows that Australopithecus africanus and other Australopithecus species were very adaptable. They weren't adapted to a specific environment, they're very adaptable. And that is the key to their success. And that is the key to their evolution into modern humans, is that adaptability. We also, in honor of Robert Broom, who had all these different dates, were able to use the fossils to determine an age of the site. Based on the fossils we found in the stratigraphy, it's probably between 2.6 and 2.8 million years old. So that's a lot different than Broom's original estimate of 10,000 years old. And so that is my story of Taung. And with that, my friends and I thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, so we can have you start unsharing your screen.
Yep.
And if people can start putting in questions, we have some questions already, but if we would always love more, of course. So we have, first off, we have people who are really excited about rodent teeth, especially Joseph Sullivan here is very excited about rodent teeth. I have a feeling he may research those. So what is the significance of rodent teeth here? Why are they, when you saw that and you knew that there was going to be more fossils, why was that? And are they helpful in biostratigraphy and all that?
They're very, very helpful, but we didn't find that many rodents. And there aren't that many rodent specialists in South Africa. I tried to give them to Margaret Avery, who is a specialist in identifying rodents, but she was more interested in doing paleoecology rather than just identifying species. So whoever it was you mentioned, if you want, you're more than welcome to go down and look at the rodent teeth and jaws and identify them.
Awesome, very cool. Joseph Sullivan also asked, there were then those baboons you showed, the skulls. Were those bite marks on them? I think there was a mark sort of towards the occipital region in the back. So do you have predation on the remains that you find at Taung?
Yes, we do have predation remains. We have leopard tooth marks on a couple of bones, and leopards are also known for leaving tooth marks on the back of skulls. So the Herdelich Pinnacle, which has a lot of fossils, particularly of baboons, was probably a leopard lair. Leopards are known to get a taste for a particular kind of animal. And so they probably had a taste for baboons, and that's why we have so many baboons and so few other fossil animals in the Herdelich site. The site near the Dart Pinnacle, the Dart deposits, it's very sparsely fossilized. And what I suspect, based on the type of sediment that it's in, is that it was a cave formation with, just like the cave I was showing you earlier, with the river running back into it, and that those fossils had washed back in, including the Taung Child, and then filled up with sediment and whatnot. So the actual death of the Taung Child could have been just about anything. It could have even been drowning, which we have quite a lot of, unfortunately, young people who drown around there in modern times. And so drowning is probably the best explanation for the death of the Taung Child. It has on its endocast an indentation back here, which is consistent with the leopard, right? It's been suggested by Lee Berger, who you mentioned earlier, that it was caught by an eagle, but I'm not one who buys into that idea because the evidence they used doesn't pan out. But that's why we do taphonomy, and try to figure out what the context of these fossils is and what happened to them after they died, and how they died, and how they lived.
Very cool. Yeah. And Wes asked the same question. What are your thoughts about the purported talon marks in the orbits of the Taung skull?
Well, yeah, the talon marks, what they interpreted as talon marks was actually not a talon mark, but a bit where the skull hadn't filled up completely. And so it's kind of an error in the endocast rather than a mark. Whereas this mark back here, this tooth mark, or what could be a tooth mark, is an actual indentation. As far as the birds go and the pecking out of the eyes, any bird can do that. We have the eggshells of the guinea fowl. A guinea fowl, just like an eagle, could peck out the eyes of an animal in there. So it might have happened that way, but after 7 years of working at Taung, I don't think it did.
Thanks. Yeah, we really appreciate all your expert opinions here. It's really cool. We have Rachel asks, have other specimens of this species been found, and also how closely is the Taung Child related to Lucy?
How closely is the Taung Child related to Lucy? Well, we have a problem with that, in that we have Australopithecus africanus in South Africa, and earlier in time we have Australopithecus afarensis in East Africa. Now they're very closely related, they're very similar. As a matter of fact, when Don Johanson first announced Australopithecus afarensis, he went to South Africa and had a huge debate with Philip Tobias about whether it was a separate species or not. Now, after years of study, we have a much larger sample of Australopithecus afarensis and a much larger sample of Australopithecus africanus, and we can see the similarities and differences. Australopithecus africanus is more advanced, I hate using the word advanced, but more evolved toward a human state. in that it has a larger cranial capacity for its body size. It has more modern teeth. So Australopithecus afarensis has larger canines and a gap known as a canine diastema. Because of those large canine teeth having to come there. Africanus has a continuous tooth row, although you can't see any teeth in the skull because it doesn't have any, but it has a continuous tooth row without that gap, without that canine diastema. So it's the next step in human evolution. How exactly they are related is yet to be determined. We need more fossils from in between, say from Malawi. We have some early Homo fossils from Malawi in between East Africa and South Africa. Now we need some older fossils from there to see just how one evolved into the other.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things that we're getting into nowadays is looking at new parts of Africa for new human fossils. Bronwyn asks, are people still searching the Taung site and the surrounding area?
There was some recent work there. About 5 years ago, and they came up with some publications, but nobody's really working there right now. I've retired from field work, so I'm not going back, but I can certainly help anybody who wants to go work there. I know more than just a bit about the site. And there are lots of fossil sites at Taung too. I forget the number. I think it's 19 fossil sites that we discovered. So there's lots more work to do there.
Very cool. Now, Wes mentions Littlefoot, a very new specimen of Australopithecus africanus. Could you speak a little bit to that and how that relates to Taung and what's that's added to the field?
Oh, Littlefoot. I have lots of thoughts on Littlefoot. The last time I saw it, it was still embedded in rock. But to me, it looked very much like Australopithecus africanus. Ron Clark wants to name it Australopithecus prometheus. He's the one who excavated it. But I think it is similar enough to africanus to be africanus. I'm also leery of the dating of it. It's in a lower member of Sterkfontein. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's that much older, being that, I mean, we have the surface site here, we have the cavern where Littlefoot is here, but below that is the modern, we'll take tours. So the stratigraphy of the cave site is very, very complicated. And the dating methods for cave sites are still fairly nascent and undeveloped and untested. So we have a lot to learn about Littlefoot. It's a magnificent specimen, but we've got a lot more to learn about it.
Wonderful, very exciting to look forward to in the future. Joseph Sullivan also asked, I'm not sure which fossil he's referencing, but he asked, is the enamel complex? Does it evolve into a more complex enamel layer?
Enamel is a very evolutionarily dynamic tissue, so that it can evolve very quickly, but it has certain features. So on this, I don't know if you can see that, doesn't focus very well. This molar, first permanent molar of the Taung Child, has a cusp pattern on its enamel that is the same as we find in chimps and gorillas. It's what's known as a Y5 cusp pattern. If you're interested, you can look it up. The tooth size and shape change fairly rapidly. You're not necessarily getting new enamel layers, but you're changing the timing of enamel formation so that it can be thicker or thinner, depending on the diet of the animal being studied.
Yeah, I remember that being one of the big problems, confusing orangutan ancestors with human ancestors, is the thickness of the enamel there. Rachel P. asks, what do you think the diet of the Taung Child was and Australopithecus africanus as a whole?
The diet, I mean, we diet based on the type of teeth that they have and the enamel thickness for that matter. And so the diet was probably mostly vegetarian. And so Australopithecus africanus lived pretty much like the modern day baboons that I was watching at Taung. They ate mostly vegetation. But I've seen the baboons at Taung. I wrote a little paper on this. I've seen them attack goats and eat meat. And that's a whole interesting story in and of itself. And with Australopithecus robustus, who has this great big face and this great big teeth, obviously evolved for grinding heavy vegetation and tough vegetation and hard vegetation. It has the chemical signatures of also eating at least some meat. So what that meat was, doesn't mean that, Australopithecus robustus was out there, chasing down impala or kudus or whatever, any kind of antelope. It could have just been eating crabs, something like that. The baboons at Taung ate crabs out of the water. I discovered that by seeing the crab shells in their feces. I never saw them do it themselves, but the crab shells came out in their feces. And if a baboon can do that, then certainly a hominin with free hands can grab a crab out of the water and eat that. So that would be a great source of nutrition. And there's some evidence that, I forget his name, there's a paleoanthropologist who studies tooth wear, and he's suggesting that indeed the scratches on the teeth suggest that they were eating something like crabs.
Yeah, it's cool all the microware stuff people get up to nowadays. I know at my school there's at least one lab that works on that. And
the problem with microware is what you're getting is the last week of the diet.
Yeah. This was a comment by Wes, but I'd like to turn it into a question. A lot of East African specialists, I think this is talking about Littlefoot, want it to be Australopithecus afarensis, and much remains to be determined. With this historical difference that we have between East African and South African paleoanthropologists, how going forward should we change in paleoanthropology to kind of integrate all of the different disparate research areas, and how can we move forward to a less biased field, with more hard science in it?
Well, we all try to be less biased, but there is a certain ownership that comes with discovering a fossil. And if you discover a fossil and name a species, you tend to dig in your heels. I swore that I would never name a new species, but I have named one species of monkey, fossil monkey. But I really had to twist my own arm to do that. And it was because it was perfectly obvious that it was a new species. But yeah, people get into camps. People get into camps within universities. That's why I'm kind of grateful to be here at Ohio State, because the politics within WITS, University of Witwatersrand, are pretty bad sometimes. But in the end, we all get together and have a beer and we'll figure it out. But it just takes time.
All right, and everyone, if you want to get one last question in, this is the time to do it. Bronwyn said taphonomy is my new word of the day, and taphonomy is so important nowadays. I've heard many paleoanthropologists emphasize its importance, and it's one of the few things I've researched. What is how significant is taphonomy going forward, and what are the new areas in taphonomy that we really want to see researched?
Oh, wow. Well, on that question, I want to go back in time rather than forward in time to the greatest move forward in taphonomy, which was by Bob Brain, then of the Transvaal Museum. And about 10 years ago, I arranged for OSU to give Bob Brain an honorary PhD from Ohio State because he was the pioneer of taphonomy, and in particularly cave taphonomy. He's the one who destroyed Dart's idea of the osteodontoceratoculture, that Australopithecus africanus was a killer ape, because he looked carefully at the bones and discerned how they got there. That's the same sort of thing that I tried to do at Taung. And moving forward, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. And now, one interesting thing on those lines is the Rising Star Cave with Hominin in South Africa. And a number of years ago, I wrote an essay question in the final exam for one of my classes. It was kind of ironic because I said, imagine you discover a cave site that has mostly hominin skulls, but no other animals. How would you interpret that in a taphonomic sense? And I just let them, there was no right or wrong answer. And then what happens 2 or 3 years later? What do they discover? Is that cave with lots of hominin fossils, but not much else of any other animal. So how do you interpret that? Well, their interpretation that they prefer is that it was a primitive mortuary practice that, essentially they were burying their dead. I tend to think it's more likely that Homo naledi, or late Homo erectus, as I like to refer to it as, there's one more taxonomic problem. I like to think of it as, someone going in there and it's dark in there. It's difficult to get in. It's even more difficult to get out when it's dark. And then someone else would go in there. But my initial reaction was someone in Homo naledi going in and then getting lost and saying, "Help, I'm lost." Someone else going in to find them, and then they both say, "Help, we're lost." And then that just keeps on going. But there are all sorts of things. It may be that rather than being a burial thing, which because it's difficult to get in, that's hard to accept. But it could be, that's where they went to die, or they went to find their ancient relatives. There's a myriad of possible explanations for that.
Well, this has been incredibly interesting. I enjoyed it so much, and everyone else in the comments is saying that they enjoyed it very much. And Julia says, "Thank you, Jeff. You brought back so many good memories in my brief time at Taung." And yeah, and I personally want to thank you for doing this and for coming out and speaking to us. It's incredibly appreciated, and I enjoyed it a lot. Do you have anything to say before we sign off, Brahma?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing your knowledge with us. It was fascinating. And next month, remember, we all come back and meet on the first Wednesday of every month. So it's August 6th, and we have a speaker on, what do we have a speaker on, Mason? It's flying.
We have a I think we entitled it "Flying Dragons." It's a new pterosaur, a new pterodactyl, as we tend to call them common wise, a new flying reptile from the dinosaur age of Australia. And they don't have many from there, and it's a very beautifully preserved fossil. So we're going to hear all about the Cretaceous of Australia from an expert at the site. So if you all want to join for that, please do. We'd love to have you.
I might join.